I decided that I would go ahead and do a video here of a presentation that I did last night, partly out of people have been requesting it, and partly because I think that it would be a useful tape to have for those people who are interested in knowing a little bit about Buddhism generally, and more specifically Tibetan Buddhism. I can't use my headphones for some reason. They're not working quite right. So I apologize for any ambient noise that may occur. Can't help that. So in any case, this is a presentation that I did about Tibetan or Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. Often it's referred to as Vajrayana Buddhism, but that is actually an incorrect title. Vajrayana Buddhism refers to an actual set of practices and is not necessarily confined to a particular culture. I think that probably the term Vajrayana Buddhism came to be used with regard to Tibetan Buddhism because a lot of the Vajrayana practices, which are essentially tantric practices or tantric meditation and breathing practices, became very associated with Tibetan Buddhism simply because of the number of lamas that came over to the United States, bringing their teachings with them after the Chinese invaded Tibet. So I think that that's probably where that term Vajrayana comes from. But experts are now referring to Tibetan Buddhism as Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. So in order to really understand specifically what this is, and this is a very general overview, it's extremely general, one obviously has to understand what Buddhism is generally and where it came from, and what is unique or what are some of the interesting features about Tibetan Buddhism generally. So what I like to say is how Buddhism became vast. And anybody who knows anything about Buddhism knows that it's an extremely diverse tradition. It's a very complex tradition. It's become very thick, as I like to say. So this will keep it as short as possible, as simple as possible. And you know, even in the remarks I'm going to make, there's going to be some wiggle room, some basis by which some people would disagree with me. And that's perfectly fine because the history of a lot of this is still sort of being written. And certainly when we talk about the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, it's very complex. So it's not easy to condense all this. The picture that you see on the right is what is commonly referred to as a thangka. This is one of the things that Tibetan Buddhism is really known for. Are their thangka paintings where they describe the various lineages, and they're sort of like revered iconography paintings, sort of like the icons in the Eastern Church, Eastern Christian Church. There are rules governing how they're painted, and conventions that are followed in order for them to be like legitimate thangkas in a sense, or legitimate pictures. This is a picture of Padmasambhava, who is considered to be one of the first and most important teachers of Buddhism in Tibet, and one of the founders of the Nyingma school, which is the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism, or so considered. And this is sort of like a lineage thangka. It's looking at all the different teachers that are said to be connected to him, etc. So first, of course, we have to look at early Buddhism. those of you listening to this, I can't assume that you necessarily know exactly who the Buddha was. So I'll give you just a very brief rendition of who the Buddha is thought to have been. He's often called Siddhartha Gautama. The Siddhartha Gautama is not really a name. These are titles. And what the titles suggest is that he was an upper caste Indian priest. That's what the stories indicate. And he was protected from life throughout much of his early life. And then, according to the most famous stories, right at the point where he was coming into sort of his final ascension, his with a new wife and child and all of the accoutrement that comes with a young princeling's inheritance, he had a series of encounters with the real world outside of the palace walls, in which he saw, members would have been basically members, subjects of his kingdom, who were starving or were poor. And he realized how much suffering was occurring outside of the world in which he lived. And he couldn't really return to the world, his world, after that. And he left it all behind in this story, and went out to try to determine how to end suffering in the world, essentially. Now, this allegedly happened, this story allegedly happened in the 5th century BCE, about 480 or so. I say allegedly, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but what is interesting about Siddhartha Gautama is that if you know Indian history, what you know is that there are a number of stories of different individuals from this same time period who are doing similar things. They are high caste individuals who are abandoning their positions in order to search for enlightenment. Another individual who has almost an identical story to that of Siddhartha Gautama is the individual who became Lord Mahavira, who was the founder of the Jains. And this is actually not a common story, but it's not an uncommon story among some of the legendary sadhus, or holy men, or forest dwellers, as they were called during this time. People going off and abandoning their high caste positions and going off into the wilderness and becoming a renunciate, essentially. And what a lot of scholars think is that during this time in the 5th century in northern India in particular, what we do know historically is that there was a lot of unrest, political unrest. It was really in many ways not unlike some of the struggles and the fights that were going on during the same time period in the city-states in Greece, which gave rise to, the classical Athenian period and the Peloponnesian War, I might add, one of the great civil wars of all time. But there was a lot of unrest, a lot of warfare, a lot of economic instability. And so these stories of these high caste individuals abandoning their positions in order to seek out the mysteries of life and how to solve the problem of suffering and rebirth this was a story that was becoming current at this time. So the Buddha, whoever he was, he fits this profile. Now, this again is not to say that he didn't exist, or that there was a person, it wasn't a person who did this. What is interesting, though, is if you look at his story, one of the components of his story is that one of the things he did was he met with all these different sadhus, all these different other people who were doing this too, who were on this search. And one group of these people encouraged him to fast and fast and fast and fast. And in fact, one of the stories says that he fasted until he became so emaciated that the wind rattled, or his breath rattled in his ribs. And he came to the conclusion that torturing yourself in that way was not an answer for him. And what is interesting about that is that that is exactly what the Jains prescribed, was that a person fast and fast and fast and fast, even starve themselves to death in order to defeat, if you will, one's own accumulated karma. So that one of the ways in which that story about him could be read is that the Dharma that he was teaching, the law that he was teaching, was not the Jain Dharma. It was the Dharma, his own Dharma. I'm going to turn something off here. So he emerged at a time when there was a lot of spiritual crisis going on in India. And 100 years after his reported death, whenever that would have been in the 4th century, his movement, which started out as, a fairly typical Indian monastic movement, very rationalist. Now, what was different about his movement was that, and actually the Jains were similar in this way as well, is that the idea basically is that you could liberate yourself in a single lifetime, dramatically shorten the amount of time that you had to go through the processes of rebirth, and that, of course, would cause suffering to cease. So 100 years after his death, the movement began to broaden to include lay people. And this was under the doctrine of upaya. There is a famous sermon that is attributed to the Buddha, and it's called his last sermon at Vulture Peak. And in that sermon, there are several versions of the sermon, obviously, but one of the things he says in this sermon is he exhorts his followers, the people who have become part of the Sangha, part of the community. He exhorts them to go out and spread this news of the Dharma to other people. And so there were many, as the movement grew, there were many who believed that what he meant by this was that these ideas should be spread, the Dharma should be spread as widely as possible to as many people as possible. And he also encouraged people to use upaya. The word upaya means skillful means. And there are many different ways in which to interpret this, but the way that this started to become interpreted was that people should be approached with this good news, this gospel of the Dharma, at whatever level they are. In other words, whatever situation they find themselves in. So any means possible, even if that means that people have to be brought along with certain devotional practices. So gradually over time, even though the Buddhism started out as a very rationalistic, even agnostic or even atheistic tradition, you certainly didn't need the gods anymore or priests of the upper castes to gain enlightenment and to get off the wheel of rebirth, at least according to the Buddha. But if people needed devotional practices, then under the doctrine of upaya, it was perfectly fine to sort of lead people along if that's what would bring them in. So about 100 years after his death, new practices and teachings began to emerge. And some of these practices were controversial, as you'll see. Now, the most important thing, though, for early Buddhism actually came around the year 260 BCE. There was an Indian emperor, a guy named Ashoka, who converted to Buddhism, and he made it his official practice. Now, there's no evidence that he actually made it the official religion of northern India, when that would have been kind of hard given the diversity of India. But he did make it his own personal practice and promoted it. And thus that sort of elevated Buddhism throughout northern India. And I have the Mara there because this was the Mauryan Empire, as it's often called. Now, Ashoka did not create this empire. I also have the names of his grandfather, Chandragupta and Bindusara. Chandragupta was his grandfather, and Bindusara was his father. And so both of these individuals prior to him had been involved in expanding this empire throughout much of India. Actually, the only part of India that they did not succeed in conquering eventually was the very tip of the southern subcontinent, the very tip of the Tamil region. Now, it's not clear how religious Emperor Ashoka really was. It's sort of like when Constantine converted to Christianity, while he was emperor, just because he was Christian officially in the Western Empire, that didn't mean that he wasn't a butthead and that he didn't still wasn't an emperor and still didn't do awful things. One of the things that Ashoka did do was during his lifetime is he set up these pillars in which he's trying to proclaim the Dharma. And some of these pillars have survived. And these pillars are set up actually kind of like the pillars of the law, like Hammurabi, in Mesopotamia. It's not really clear where he got the idea of putting up these pillars. He's also the person who began to build the large stupas for the Buddha, commemorating the Buddha, that archaeologists later uncovered in northeastern India. So what he was trying to do was make Buddhism into an okay thing. And because he promoted Buddhism, Buddhism did spread as a result of this. And it spread into Southeast Asia, although the kind of Buddhism that spread was principally what is now called Theravada Buddhism. And Buddhism also spread, or began its spread, up into Afghanistan and to Central Asia, and eventually, obviously, to China and Japan. And it was largely because it was being promoted by Ashoka. Now, just to give a little bit of historical sort of context here, Chandragupta, when he came to power, we know, because there are extant texts describing this, that he was in contact with the rulers who had succeeded Alexander the Great in Iran and what is now Pakistan, or Persia and what is now Pakistan. Alexander the Great had, of course, conquered much of the Near East and much of the Mediterranean, and had gotten all the way to just the eastern side of the Indus when he was stopped by the armies of mostly of the early Mauryan army, who met him with a really large elephant army and pretty much stopped his spread up to that point. And what we do know is that Chandragupta, there was some member, I can't remember whether it was like a niece or a daughter, but was actually married to one of the nobles in Persia, who was a Greco-Persian ruler, one of the sub-rulers that came into power after Alexander the Great died. So this shows sort of a connection between Greece and the Indian Empire. And what we do know is that when Ashoka promoted Buddhism and Buddhism began to spread, when it got into Afghanistan and further into Central Asia, it connected, there was a lot of contact between Greeks and Buddhists and Zoroastrians in the place of what is now Afghanistan, and it created an incredibly interesting civilization that is now known to history as Bactria. And Bactria was a Greco-Buddhist Zoroastrian civilization, if you can believe that. That's what those really big Buddhas that the Taliban destroyed, those were remnants, artifacts from that civilization. And this is important because it actually changed the way in which the Buddha was portrayed. The earliest statues of the Buddha show the Buddha being a kind of an emaciated Indian dude, kind of a typical sadhu. But the Buddha in Afghanistan before going to China is a much more naturalistic Buddha. with a lot of Greek features, including the wearing of Greek-like togas and that sort of thing. And it is thought that some of those conventions of iconography actually eventually made their way even into certain types of Thangka painting. So this is like one of those interesting sort of multicultural mishmashes. Now, Bindusara, I think it is Bindusara. I can't remember now whether it was Chandragupta or Bindusara. I don't remember which one. But one of these two guys, either the grandfather or the father, converted to Jainism and actually became a Jain and starved himself to death. So you can see that there's the influence of these other spiritual movements, if you will, occurring during even Ashoka's lifetime. Ashoka, like I said, we don't really know how deeply serious his personal commitment to Buddhism was. He was apparently a pretty violent dude. There are rumors that he killed off a lot of his brothers in order to become emperor because he was not favored of his father. He had apparently some kind of skin condition, and his father regarded that as really bad karma and didn't even want him around. So it's sort of the typical stories of any ruling family, if you will. Once Ashoka died, his empire fell apart, and the problem with Buddhism was that, of course, for the ruling castes, is that Buddhism really stresses that enlightenment is a personal thing, that you and your own effort bring about your own enlightenment. You don't need the priests, you don't need the upper castes. And and especially Theravada Buddhism really emphasizes that your personal responsibility is to yourself and to your own enlightenment. And there are apparently some historical instances of people becoming Buddhist as a kind of rebellion, political rebellion against the caste system. This has even happened in modern times. Less than a decade ago, a huge population of lower caste individuals in Delhi converted en masse, like 35,000 of them converted en masse to Buddhism so that they could escape the caste system, because it does permit them to do that. So what ended up happening is that after Ashoka died and his empire started falling apart and people began divvying up territory again, it became much more advantageous for various of these rulers to once again promote in various ways Hinduism or what would become Hinduism. And it is in fact during this time period that we see the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, of which the Bhagavad Gita is a principal text, of course. That's when those texts reach their final form, are in the years right after Ashoka. And if you carefully read those texts, what those texts are all about is they're all about how important it is for people to be devotional and to follow their dharma, to follow their caste, to follow the position in life that you've been born into. And in fact, the Bhagavad Gita basically makes a revolutionary claim. It claims, and if you read it carefully, you can tell that there are ways in which the text is actually critiquing some of these different philosophical schools, like the Jains and the Buddhists. Buddhism was referred to in Hinduism at the time as Jnana Yoga. So the yoga of the gnosis. Jnana and the word gnosis basically are cognates in different languages. And basically what the Bhagavad Gita says, what Lord Krishna says as an avatar of Vishnu, what he says is basically gives the same promise that the Buddha does, with this caveat: if you worship me, if you are devoted to me in bhakti yoga, then when you die, even though you have screwed up in your life and you haven't done everything right, he says to Arjuna, and you haven't done everything right, if you call upon my name at the time of your death, I will pop you out of the cycle of rebirth. So he basically promises what Buddhism was promising. It's just that you have to follow your dharma and cast all your cares on Lord Krishna. So and it's during this time period, at the same time, that what we now know as classical Hinduism then develops, and it develops sort of in contrast to the political and religious challenges posed by schools like Buddhism and Jainism. Now, there were places where Buddhism was banned in India in the years subsequent to Ashoka, but it wasn't banned outright. And up until the present day, Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains all together engaged in very vigorous philosophical and religious debate. And it is actually from that sort of really rich debate that occurs that the elements are put in place for what will later become Tibetan Buddhism. Because when Tibetans start inviting Buddhists to come, they're going to be inviting Buddhists to come who have been involved in these Hindu, Buddhist, Jain discussions. So that's why it's important to know all that history. It's a lot of history, but it's actually really interesting, and it gives a context for what will happen in Tibet. So by the time of Ashoka's death, you begin to see the split between the two main types of Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravadan Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, which I'll explain in a minute what that means, that became the Buddhism that spread more widely in Central Asia, China, than Korea and Japan. And that's because of its relationship with what is called Pure Land Buddhism, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then Theravada Buddhism, which is, you might say, the older school of Buddhism. The word Theravada means like the ancient teaching, or the teaching of the elders that has been given down to us. This becomes more dominant in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and spreads more widely in Southeast Asia. So I already talked about the interactions between Jain, Hindu, and Buddhist philosophers. Buddhism did become more politically unpopular in India, and especially in those places where Ashoka came from or that were associated with the Buddha's birth. And in fact, the places that were associated with the Buddha's birth, such as Vulture Peak, and the places where Ashoka had built a couple of his stupas, those places became actually rejected for a while and had to be refound by the British, actually, in the 19th century. Buddhism became so unknown in the land of its birth, in the region of its birth, that for many, many years in the West, it was thought that Buddhism had originated in China, when in fact it had originated in India. Now, by 153 CE, you have the development of a particular kind of devotional Buddhism that is called Pure Land Buddhism. And it is a movement within the Mahayana movement, the Mahayana branch, if you will, of Buddhism. And Pure Land Buddhism is a more devotional form of Buddhism. One of the things that characterizes Mahayana Buddhism and differentiates it from Theravada is the doctrine of the Bodhisattva, the individual who has achieved enlightenment but decides not to enter into nirvana, takes a vow until and will not enter into nirvana until all sentient beings have been liberated. And one of the ancillary, if you will, doctrines or ideas behind with that is that there are some bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara being one of them, but there are a number of them. There are some bodhisattvas that are so powerful, they have so much merit, that they've been able to create what are called pure lands. And what pure lands are, they're sort of like positive purgatories. That's the best way to talk about them. They are places where if you die, if you have spent time concentrating on Amitabha or Avalokiteshvara or one of the Taras, that what these bodhisattvas do is that they've created these realms that when you die, you go to them. They're sort of like intermediate realms. And the conditions are such there that it is much easier for you to have time to meditate and achieve nirvana. So they actually sort of help you along your way by helping you to be reborn into a better place so that then you can go on. It's sort of, I've always considered it quite a tribute to how difficult life must have been sometimes. So Pure Land Buddhism began to develop and is first sort of seen in text in 153 CE. One of the most famous of the sutras connected to this is the Lankavatara Sutra, which is actually one of my favorite sutras. It's a beautiful sutra, and that sutra provides a full description of the Bodhisattva and what the Bodhisattva does, and the beginning descriptions of what a Pure Land is. Pure Land Buddhism became extremely popular in China, Korea, and then Japan, and it remains the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan. We associate Zen with Japan, and that's only because it was Zen teachers from Japan who first came to the United States. But in fact, in Japan proper, it's Pure Land Buddhism that is the most popular form of Buddhism. Now, by the 7th century CE, and to keep, to again give you a context, the beginning of the 7th century is when Muhammad dies and the spread of Islam begins. By that time, highly ritualized forms of Pure Land Buddhism began to filter into Tibet, where it was called Nongchos. And it was essentially adopted by the ruling court. And it was also during that time that Sanskrit, a version of Sanskrit, was adopted for the writing system. So these are the two main divisions of Buddhism. The Theravada Buddhists, and I'll just, this will be part of the video, so you can just kind of stop the video and look at it. And I've already alluded to a lot of this. The Theravada Buddhists really focus on individual enlightenment, and in fact, while there are some religious features to Theravada Buddhism, Theravada priests, for example, will do funerals and marriages and things like that. The fact is that there's not a lot of devotional practices. There are some memorial practices for the Buddha, but there are not a lot, you don't pray to other deities or things like that. You don't have a doctrine of the Bodhisattva, none of that. And most priests, while there are lay people, obviously, that are Theravada Buddhists, most of the people who are true Buddhist functionaries, they are nuns or monks. And it centers on meditation. What's most important for, if you're watching this for the purposes of universal worship, is that the Dhammapada, which is contained within the Tripitaka, these are the only canonical works of Theravada Buddhism. There are some commentaries of subsequent people that are considered to be important and often used, but the Dhammapada and the Tripitaka are really what is focused on. So if you're going to be doing universal worship, you need to really focus on the Dhammapada and the Tripitaka, because they're accepted by Mahayana Buddhists too, but Theravada Buddhists do not accept much of what is in the Mahayana canon, of which it's huge, and it depends on whether you're Zen or Pure Land or what you are, Tian Tai or Chan or whatever. And Mahayana Buddhism, because there is this intermediary called the Bodhisattva, it's understood that you don't necessarily need to work for enlightenment in one life. And your efforts towards enlightenment should include all sentient beings, all living beings. And rather than wisdom being the principal value, compassion is the principal value. And Mahayana Buddhists encourage lay participation. And again, there are all these different beings. There are, gods and goddesses can be connected to this. Bodhisattvas are an important component of Mahayana Buddhism. The earliest texts of Mahayana Buddhism are actually in Sanskrit rather than Pali, which is a dialect of Sanskrit. And there's no one canon. you have lots and lots and lots of different books. So that, for example, among certain Mahayana Buddhists, the Lotus Sutra in Japan it is very important. Other Buddhists, other Mahayana Buddhists, you'll have the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which are an important component of what makes its way into Tibet. In fact, the Prajnaparamita Sutras are another set of sutras from which the doctrines of the Bodhisattva are drawn. So it's important to know about these two main divisions. Theravada, if anybody listening to this is familiar with the Vipassana training schools, those are based on Theravada meditation techniques. So Theravada has been reaching out too. And in fact, Theravada is preferred for some people because it really doesn't emphasize any deities. So if people have a real aversion to religious stuff, Theravada Buddhism might be a more, something that is better for you. But Mahayana Buddhism historically has been far more popular. So what is common to both kinds of Buddhism, besides the Buddha? And I'm not going to go through all of this because in detail, except to just point it out. What's common to both schools of Buddhism, both Theravada and Mahayana, is the Four Noble Truths, which are on the left, and the Eightfold Path, which is on the right. What differs is how they talk about how these things are accomplished, essentially. So you might want to read through these things. The only thing that I will say is that I like to actually use the word dukkha rather than suffering, that life is suffering, because that's not actually what the Pali says. What the Pali says is that existence or reality is dukkha, or restlessness. It's not that you're always suffering. It's that human beings are never satisfied. Even if life is really, really good, we want that to stay that way, and we're afraid that we're going to lose it, or it's not quite enough, depending on what it is and who you are. So life is not, at its most basic, life is not satisfying. I'll put it that way. In the end, you will get sick and die, or even if you don't get sick and die, you will die. So it's temporary. It's frustrating. It's itchy, and that's what is meant by restlessness. By dukkha is restlessness and dissatisfying. The other thing that some of you might wonder, some of you might have seen the term Hinayana. Well, Hinayana is a pejorative term that the Mahayana Buddhists use to describe the Theravada Buddhists. Mahayana means great vehicle or great raft to sit upon. And Hinayana means little raft or little vehicle. And apparently it had sort of pejorative context, like these are narrow-minded little people over here. And so Theravada Buddhists objected to that. It's like, no, we follow the original teachings, the teachings that have been specifically handed down by the elders. So that's what they prefer to be called. But depending on what you read, you might run up against the term Hinayana. So on to Tibet. So Buddhism made its way into Tibet in several stages. The first stage, which is called the first dissemination, occurred approximately in the 7th century, as I indicated. And as far as we know, the ruler Dzogchen Gampo invited Buddhist teachers to his court. For those of you who are familiar with Twin Peaks, you might remember that Agent Cooper actually tells this little story, and he doesn't use this guy's name. He uses the honorifics of this guy's name. But it's the same dude. It's the same basic story, referring to them as the happy generation, that sort of thing. So basically, Dzogchen Gampo invited Buddhist teachers in, and he himself was interested in Buddhism, but it took another century for Buddhism to sort of begin the process of disseminating widely. And it's important to know what's going on in Tibet at this time. The picture that I show you here is a picture of the Tibetan Empire as it was at its fullest extent. We tend to think of Tibetans as being, very enlightened, quiet people now, but the fact is that historically, the Tibetans were pretty power hungry and intense. I mean, they are related to the Mongols and the Turks, and they gave the Chinese runs for their money. If you notice on the eastern boundary of the Tibetan Empire at its greatest extent, it bucks right up against Chang'an, which was the capital during the Tang Dynasty. And so the Tibetans were known to be crabby warriors and implacable, with a lot of political intrigue that went on with their different aristocratic ruling families. And the thing to understand about Tibetan schools as Buddhism begins to filter into Tibet is that a lot of times what will happen is you'll have a ruling family or a family patriarch invite Buddhist teachers to his court, and then that patriarch or that family will become associated with that particular teacher or that type of Buddhism, and then in order to keep up with the Joneses, then in another region hearing about this, another aristocratic patriarch would invite different groups of Buddhists to come up. So eventually, within a century, what happens is that there are increasingly Buddhism is spreading, but it's spreading because it's sort of become, exotic. It's become the thing to have a Buddhist scholar at your court, that sort of thing. Finally, in the 8th century, Trisong Detsen invited Padmasambhava and son Taraskita to his court. And it's Padmasambhava that is associated with the first actual establishment of the first monastery and the first school in Tibet, and the foundation of the Nyingma, or the Ancient Ones schools. And this was founded in the 770s. So I have a picture here of that first monastery. Still exists. It's called Samye, and it was built between 775 and 779. It's been obviously repaired and built on several times since then. The Chinese have not destroyed it because it's considered a historical landmark, and of course they want to try to tell the world that they haven't trashed the place, so they have permitted it to remain largely intact. So, further Buddhist infusions occurred mostly after the 11th century. From the 9th through the 11th century, the Tibetan Empire itself collapsed into civil conflict. However, interestingly enough, Buddhism flourished. The Buddhist teachers had their work cut out for them. And there is evidence that they worked really, really hard in order to try to manage violence, help populations deal with the civil conflicts. It's a very difficult period. And various teachers beginning in the 11th century and into the 12th started bringing various of their teachings in. So Atisha, who was a teacher from Bengal, he started the Kadampa school, which was eventually folded into the Nyingma school. It has a lot of tantric stuff in it, especially some of the Tara stuff that's associated with the Nyingma school as part of the contribution of the Kadampa school, or the old Kadampa school. Indian teacher named Varupa founded the Shakya school. What's interesting about the Shakya school is that it's the only Tibetan school that is still associated almost exclusively with the original aristocratic family that it was connected to, the Kun family. Then Naropa, Milarepa, Marpa, these are all Indian teachers. They founded the Kagyu school. And this is all of this is part of what's called the second dissemination. So the first dissemination happened in the 7th century. The second dissemination happened in the 10th, 11th, and early 12th century. So as I said, often families and regions were associated with schools. Sometimes this fed conflicts and some competition, but it does appear to be the case that at least some of the teachers in some of these schools were trying really hard to quell some of that violence and deal with it. Finally, in the 12th century, the entire region was conquered by the Mongols, who had also conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty. Once Tibet was conquered, the Mongols connected most with the Shakya school because they had sort of they were the most one of the more administratively advanced of the different rulers and regions, and so they were made dominant, and the Mongols essentially adopted Buddhism as their official faith and actually made things like Manichaeism illegal. And it was during this period that the first Tibetan Buddhist canons started to be printed. So that happened during the 12th century. And as I say, Mongols, the Chinese, and Tibetans, oh my. In the mid-14th century, the Black Plague hit, and it hit China before it hit Europe, and was just as devastating. And it completely destabilized the Yuan dynasty, which was already sort of on shaky legs anyway. So the Chinese threw the Mongols out, established the Ming dynasty, and patronized the Tibetan courts. Now, here's the important thing to remember. The Mongols had moved the capital of China from Chang'an, where it had been before, to the present-day city of Beijing. So that's when that happened. What that meant was that while Chang'an was still an important city, it had lost a lot of prestige as a result of that move. And so the western frontier was actually a frontier that the Chinese were very afraid of. They were afraid of invasions. This is part of why they built again during this time period parts of the Great Wall. They were very afraid of being invaded again. There had always been a number of different types of skirmishes that they'd had to deal with the Tibetans, and then later the Mongols. So they patronized which sounds kind of weird to hear about Chinese patronizing anybody, but they patronized the Tibetan courts because they didn't want, they were trying to figure out a deal by which to keep the Tibetans mollified so that they would not invade the western part of China. The Mongols, on the other hand, were kind of pissed off, that they had been thrown out. So the Tibetans and the Mongols basically began the process that would lead to the creation of the position of Dalai Lama. Now, one of the things that had emerged in the 13th and then 14th century was a new Tibetan school, a new Buddhist school, and these were based on the great synthesis of Je Tsongkhapa, who had basically taken all of these Indian teachings, the Mahamudra, Nargujanas, Madhyamika, School of Moderation, Middle Way School, Tantras, all of these different things, and created this massive synthesis of Tibetan that was peculiarly Tibetan Buddhism. And it's called The Great Exposition of the Stages of the Path. It's only recently been completely translated into English, and it's massive. I don't have a copy of it, but I have seen it. It's a very creative synthesis. And out of this came the Gelug school. The Gelug Buddhists were also really avid proselytizers. And in fact, that has been a feature of the Gelug school, that they've been active proselytizers, which hasn't been true of all of the Tibetan schools. So basically, the Tibetans and the Mongols created, if you will, the Dalai Lama position as a means by which to give both parties leverage with the Chinese. What basically there had been several teachers, there had been like a couple of teachers of the Gelug school to the Mongols in the years prior to 1577, which is when the first official Dalai Lama is established, is in 1577. And they made that Dalai Lama the third Dalai Lama and sort of posthumously, retroactively dubbed two of those earlier teachers the second and first Dalai Lama in order to make this third Dalai Lama look like, you know, he was part of a lineage that had been established for a little while. You know, it was very important. And part of this, part of what they used to sort of leverage this idea was the idea of the tulku. And what a tulku is it's an individual who is a reincarnation of someone who has been enlightened. And there were already individuals within various of the schools where that claim was made, that they had died and that they had been reincarnated in a subsequent lama. Well, it's really the Gelug school that sort of privileges this, and of course made this the central feature of the Dalai Lama's lineage, that he is the reincarnation in physical form of Avalokiteshvara, of an aspect of Avalokiteshvara, the great bodhisattva. The Gelug school is also the school that is called the Yellow Hat school. Some of you may have heard of the Red Hats and the Yellow Hats. All of the other schools of Tibet are the Red Hat school, and the Gelug school is the Yellow Hat school. So that's where the differentiation comes from. There are stories about why Yellow Hat. I tend to think it's just was simply to distinguish them and to connect them to the Dalai Lama specifically. Now the Dalai Lama really, the Chinese really didn't like this idea of the Dalai Lama. And so through further negotiations, the position of the Panchen Lama was established. And the Panchen Lama is supposed to be sort of the second in power to the Dalai Lama, in spiritual power to the Dalai Lama. And so you basically have the Dalai Lama and then the Panchen Lama. And what's happened more recently in the 1990s is that after the Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, after he recognized the new incarnation of the Panchen Lama, the Chinese abducted and absconded the Panchen Lama, and he hasn't been seen since like 1995 or 1997. We don't really know like where he is. And they established they chose their own Panchen Lama, and apparently actually passed laws in which they declared that Chinese law was going to govern the process of reincarnation, which of course made everybody laugh, and nobody recognizes the Panchen Lama that they have designated. And in answer to this, the present Dalai Lama has said that he will not reincarnate in order to keep the Chinese from being able to use their proclamation as a means by which to try to control the destinies of the Tibetan people. So, I mean, all of this weird stuff, right? Now, the Dalai Lama has also been very important in helping to support what's called the Rime movement, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the Rime movement is in a minute. So let's talk briefly, very basically, about the schools of Tibet. And the examples that I'm going to be bringing up do not represent the sum total of all the teachers or completely represent the totality of all the schools. I just want to provide some examples so that you'll be able to say, oh, that's what this is associated. And just because somebody is a member of one school doesn't mean that you are prohibited from using practices in another. And this is especially true now because, almost all the important gurus and lamas are in exile. So there's been a lot of exchange back and forth between the different schools. So and they're Buddhist, so it's important to see them as not being terribly exclusive from each other. So these are the four schools, as I say, sort of. And there are more sub-schools than what I have listed here, but especially in the Kagyu order. But I'm not going to talk that much about them. And of course, we have here at the right the present Dalai Lama, the 14th, who will be the last Dalai Lama that we know of, at least in reincarnational form. And The actual purpose of the Dalai Lama changed over time. He didn't start out as a real political figure, even though it was political, it was political machinations that brought the position into being. He was understood to be a spiritual leader. But if you look at the history of the various Dalai Lamas, it's like a history of any of the crowned heads of Europe. Just a lot of, just because you were a Dalai Lama did not make you a more enlightened person necessarily. A lot of political machinations, back and forth, competition, etc. Obviously, when the Chinese invaded Tibet, and the Dalai Lama and a lot of other important lamas and gurus had to go into exile, it changed the nature of the position of the Dalai Lama. All of a sudden, he was representing the entire Tibetan people in exile. So he became sort of the de facto complete spiritual and political leader of the Tibetan people generally. And so what the present Dalai Lama began to do in the 1970s, even though he was technically a member of the Gelug school, he began incorporating elements of a lot of the other schools, inviting teachers of the other schools to Dharmasala and connecting with them in a variety of ways. And out of that came what is called the Rime movement, which I have here at the bottom. And what the Rime movement is it's a movement to bring all of the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism together as a whole, not to homogenize them, but to bring them together into, say, an umbrella, so that they can all preserve the most important components of themselves, and so that they can also have exchange and interaction. So, for example, I know in Kansas City, Missouri, there's a Rime Center. I think in New York City, there's a Rime Center. And these centers act as places where all of the different Buddhist schools, Tibetan Buddhist schools, can come, and they can all have a place there, essentially. So that's what Rime is. Now, so what you see here, the Nyingma, that's a Red Hat school, and then Kandam underneath that is a prominent sub-school. And then you have the Shakya school, Kagyu school, these are all Red Hat schools, and then the Gelug school or the Yellow Hat school. And now out of not all Buddhists agreed with what the Dalai Lama has done in this regard. And in the early mid-1970s, a booklet began to circulate, and I cannot recall the name of it now, but the booklet began to circulate, which was accusing the Dalai Lama of corrupting the transmission of the Gelug school, and eventually what ended up happening is some of the more radical members of this faction who disagreed with what the Dalai Lama was doing, they created a school that they call the New Kadampa school. And it's not that they have completely separated themselves out from the rest of Tibetan Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhist community, but they have sort of engaged in self-exile, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But there have been some stinky stuff going on there. They've become sort of sectarians, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. But they were originally a part of the Gelug school, and now they consider themselves to actually be sort of an independent school that is distinct. And of course, they claim that they are the only Tibetan school that is carrying on a true lineage, a true ancestral lineage. So let's look at the Gelug school here. This is Se Tsongkhapa on the right. It's kind of a classical tanka of him. Probably the best known representative of the Gelug school was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was, of course, the teacher of Pema Chodron, who is very, very well known. Now, Pema Chodron has been influenced by a lot of the other schools, in addition to her teacher, Chogyam Trungpa. And so, but one of the things that the Gelug school does really, really emphasize is that in order to get the full measure of Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment possibilities, it is really important to at least consider ordination as a nun or a monk. They really do emphasize this. They don't reject the participation of lay people. You have to have participation of lay people anyway, but they really, really, really emphasize the importance of if you want to go the full length of things, that you become a nun or a monk. And that's what Pema Chodron did. And in fact, what Pema Chodron did, I mean, the important thing about what she has done is that she has been instrumental in saving a lot of the materials for nuns, for Tibetan nuns, and preserving those in the West. There's a complex system of lamas and initiations that you're supposed to go through in order to. So it's very hierarchical, and this shouldn't surprise you, since the Dalai Lama traditionally was at the head of this school. They emphasize mind training, retreat, philosophical discipline, and empowerments. They don't tend to be overly religious. They're not as devotional as a lot of the other, several of the other Buddhist schools. They don't deny that that's important. You can certainly do those things, and certainly the New Kadampa movement has a lot of devotional components in it. So it is possible to do those things. But certainly as lay people are trained in this, lay people are not trained generally in the more intensely religious stuff, except some of the basics. You have to be ordained or have certain types of empowerments in order to do this. The principal spokesperson for the New Kadampa movement is Geshe Kelsang Gyatso, and he has been establishing New Kadampa centers throughout the world. He's particularly popular in Britain, in the UK, and in parts of Europe, although certainly in the United States there are New Kadampa centers. What is interesting about New Kadampa is that it presents itself as a complete Tibetan Buddhist system, including all the tantras, whatever it is you want to do, without any reference whatsoever to the Dalai Lama or anything else. So you could become involved with New Kadampa and not even know that there's all of this other stuff in Tibetan Buddhism, because there's like literally no reference to it. The New Kadampa movement has decided that it's going to ensure that Tibetan Buddhism, at least its form of Tibetan Buddhism, is going to survive regardless of the Dalai Lama, in spite of the Dalai Lama, if you will. Some of the stink that occurred in the 1990s occurred. There is a Dharma protector that is associated with New Kadampa, who's known as Dorje Shugden, and there are some specific Buddhist texts, devotional texts, that are associated with this Dharma protector. What is a Dharma protector? A Dharma protector is kind of think of them as a guardian angel. That's the best way that that's not exactly what they are, especially in Buddhism, but that's probably the closest analogy that we in the West have to them. Basically, they are beings who in the other realms protect the various instruments of the Dharma, be it the teachings, the Sangha, the community, the institutions, whatever. And Dorje Shugden is a particularly aggressive Dharma protector, and one of his texts was interpreted by some New Kadampa devotees who had particular problems with what the Dalai Lama was doing, and they actually took it upon themselves to act in Dorje Shugden's behalf as Dharma protectors, and actually attacked some people in Dharmasala, and I think one or two people were killed. I don't recall now, but in sort of a semi-terroristic act. And obviously this is not something that the leaders of the New Kadampa movement agreed with. It wasn't like they directed these people to do this. They did this entirely on their own. But there was some concern that the vigorousness with which the New Kadampa movement leaders were criticizing the Dalai Lama might have led to this. So one of the things that ended up happening is that the Dalai Lama forbade invocations to Dorje Shugden in his abode, in his area, so as to not encourage them. And this has led to, crabbiness on the part of all, essentially. The Kagyu school is actually a consortium of several older Buddhist schools. This is a classic tanka of the Kagyu hierarchy, and it basically shows all of these different schools and teachers that have come together sort of under one umbrella. They tend to emphasize the practices of Mahamudra, which are breathing and body exercises, body meditations. They also emphasize Lojong, the Lojong teachings, which Pema Chodron has introduced to the West. And these are little sayings that are used in order to, as sort of psychological helps. And the Lojong teachings were actually created specifically for lay people, in addition to obviously being able to be used by others. The other thing that the Kagyu school is known for are the 6 dharmas of Naropa, including the yoga of inner heat, dream yoga, certain types of meditative yoga that are very specific to Naropa. And some of these practices actually influence Chogyam Trungpa. So again, it just because you're a member of one school doesn't mean you can't use teachings from another. The Kagyu school is also associated with esoteric practices of Chud, the Kala Chakra, and Tara-related practices that they have gotten from the Nyingma and Kadam schools. Now, I think probably what set the New Kadampa school off about the Dalai Lama is that the Dalai Lama accepted the high initiation of Kala Chakra, which is one of the highest tantric initiations in the Kagyu school. So basically, the Dalai Lama, and then Chogyam Trungpa himself did as well, they both accepted very high initiations in another school. And that's probably part of what ticked New Kadampa off, is that they did this. The Kagyu school is often associated with some of the more ritualistic practices. If you've seen some of the implements, any of you, that Tibetan Buddhists are connected to. While other Buddhists may use these implements too, the Kagyu school is particularly associated with the use of some of these implements. Like I mentioned before, the Shakya school is the school that is still linked to the male hereditary line of the Kun family. That is still the case. My understanding is that there are still some Shakya family members that are still in Tibet trying to sort of, deal with the Chinese. But they have been coming actually, to the West and stay in northern India as well. One of the things that they are the most known for is they have collected a massive store of Indian, Hindu, and Buddhist tantric texts, and they're known for scholarship and text preservation as well as commentary. They do a lot of ministering to lay people. And it's because of their ministering to lay people that the Mongols originally recognized their administrative abilities and so utilized them that way. So that's a lot of what they do. They do have monks and nuns that are associated with them, but the monks and nuns are generally connected to the family, that family in some way, and so they minister then to lay people. This is my understanding. If someone knows more about it, they can correct me on that. And then there's the oldest school, the school that I personally actually do most of my work with. And this is the Nyingma school. Nyingma means, the ancient ones. And some of the practices that are connected to Nyingma are Dzogchen, which means the great perfection. And it is a combination of traditional Tibetan practice, indigenous practice with Buddhist practice, kind of where the two of those meet, if you will. Nyingma also really emphasizes guru yoga, and And it's in Nyingma that you will see a lot of the Pure Land practices that have been preserved in Tibet. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of external ritual. There is some. Certainly people are free to do it. But a lot of what is, especially to lay people, what is emphasized are what are called internal rituals or internal sadhana. So what sadhana basically means religion or ritual or rite, and so, or practice, if you will. And so a lot of the rituals, so-called Nyingma rituals, are actually conducted on an internal level. They're kind of like a really involved creative visualization or imaginative visualization. And some of these do involve the process of imagining yourself as a bodhisattva creating a pure world, a pure land, which is interesting. It's in the Nyingma school that you see the emphasis on Avalokiteshvara, Amitabha, the Taras, and of course the Taras came from the Kadam school. The Nyingma movement has contributed significantly to the Rimé movement, and it is the most widespread of all of the Tibetan schools. So if you go to Japan, for example, and you see Shingon, which is has become highly ritualistic, a lot of their stuff is Nyingma. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And that became sort of the, I think Shingon became the dominant Buddhist tradition of the imperial family, if I'm not mistaken, in Japan. Now, this person that you see here on the right, that is Ekajati, that is, or blue Tara or black Tara. And this is actually an entity or an energy that I work with a lot. I have a couple of Tara empowerments, and one day Ekajati, and this was several years ago, just actually showed up in a dream. And I didn't really know who she was at first, except that I remembered some very specific features about her, and I went and looked her up, and it was her. So I've been working with her ever since. And she is a very interesting energy to work with. She's a fierce Tara. So what I'm now going to show you are some of the things that I do, what my Tibetan Buddhist practice has been. I know that I'm basically a Sufi, and you all know that I'm basically a Sufi, but early in my spiritual career, I sat with Buddhists, hung out with Buddhists for a number of years, and in Kansas City at what became the Shambhala Center. I got a number of empowerments and had a bunch of experiences. And so this has always been a part of my life, regardless of whatever else I do. So basically, when I started sitting in meditation, I was originally trained by disciples who were directly under Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He was still alive at the time. This was in the early 80s. And of course, he had started the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado. But the Shambhala Center being what it was, and this was before the Rimé movement had actually gotten started, they would invite teachers from other schools. And so Nyingma teachers would show up. And I received a number of empowerments under Nyingma teachers. There were some teachers, I would just go to meditate, and I would happen to show up when a teacher was there and just sort of, the way I think of it is just flinging empowerments at people. I don't know that they fling empowerments quite like this anymore. But I ended up sitting and getting empowerments and not even knowing what that meant, not even knowing that later on these dudes and dudesses would show up, in my dreams and say, well, what do you want to do now? And okay. And so I had, it's not, you don't have to start working with them, but I found it was useful to start working with them because these energies are activated when certain things happen in your life, and they're there to help you with those things. So I started working with them and have ever since. There were some new Kadampa teachers that did come a couple times, and this was before all the big stink about what the Dalai Lama was doing occurred. And I did receive a Vajrayogini empowerment under a new Kadampa teacher. I have worked with Vajrayogini a few times. She is actually a Tibetan version of the Hindu goddess Chinnamasta, which I will let you look Chinnamasta up. She's a very specific and actually rather rare goddess figure. She's a form of Tara. But even in India, she's not that common. So Vajrayogini is a very specific sort of aspect of her. And I have worked with Vajrayogini some, but I have found that it isn't necessary to work with her as much as I used to. Now, I include the copy of this white Tara Sadhana on the right, just simply to point out certain things. This is a short sadhana. It's a form of guru and what's called deity yoga. Excuse me. And the first part of it, the refuge and generating bodhicitta and the 4 immeasurable thoughts and the 7 limbs, these are features of almost every layperson's sadhana. Those are very classic features of most sadhanas. What is different about this particular sadhana is the outer and inner mandala visualization. And usually you don't have this. Like if you were to just go and do a Google search on White Tara Sadhana, you would not find the actual visualizations for outer and inner mandala just in the sadhana. Mostly because it's assumed that you already know this, you see, because that's part of the empowerment in the teaching of your empowerment. It's not usually spelled out. And so I decided I would show this because this is one of those interesting things that I discovered in my process of working with these entities, with these energies. And it completely changed not only my Buddhist practice, but it changed all my other spiritual practices as well. If you look carefully after you take refuge and do all that kind of stuff, in fact, the 7 limbs, I think this comes right out of, it's either the Prajna Paramita Sutra or I think it's out of the Prajna Paramita Sutra or out of the Heart Sutra. I can't remember exactly, but that's like the 7 limbs thing is just literally out of a scripture that it's just plunked right here into the sadhana. But the first thing that you do is you imagine the outer mandala. The outer mandala is, and this is a shortened version of imagining your own Pure Land, imagining your own internal world. And this is a tantric practice. That's part of the reason why you don't see it everywhere. It's a tantric practice, but you imagine your own internal world, and you realize at a certain point when you do this that you're developing your own Pure Land. It's like a sneaky way of making you a bodhisattva and you didn't know it. The reason they call it the outer mandala is because in your consciousness, you tend to see it as internal. And so you don't live in it. It's outer to you, even though you're imagining it inside of yourself. You know, we experience it as imagining it inside of ourselves, but it's called outer because we tend in our own conscious minds not to live there. We have to go there, you see, and that's what makes it outer. Inner mandala, if you read it carefully, it's talking about the attachments of this world. Why is it called inner? Because consciously you live in it. It surrounds you. You see, so what's interior is called outer. What seems to be exterior is called inner. And when you actually experience this on a meditative level, you realize that there's no difference. When you actually do this, you realize that the boundary between the interior and the exterior world is just apparent. And I've had the really weird experience of actually having both those realities just flat on top of each other, seeing them almost fused as if I was seeing simultaneously the screens of 2 televisions broadcasting at the same time. It's really has caused really interesting experiences. And it's at that point then in this sadhana that you begin the guru yoga. and or the deity yoga, and you imagine first you see Tara before you, and then you see Tara connecting to you, and then you become Tara, and those two worlds, they merge, and then as you're sitting here, you're Tara. It's really interesting. If you've never done anything like this, you can try it. You're not supposed to work on a particular deity unless you've had the empowerment. But, I don't know that white Tara or green Tara would kill you. I mean, it is Avalokiteshvara in any case. According to the story, here, let me just show you the next picture, and then I can actually show you this with a graphic. So Avalokiteshvara is who's on the left, and the Buddha that is associated with Avalokiteshvara is Amitabha on the right. And Avalokiteshvara is considered to be the great Bodhisattva of compassion, the extraordinary Bodhisattva of compassion. And he's actually allegedly associated with one of the, as an reincarnation of one of the Buddha's most favorite disciples, whose name I cannot remember now. That's sort of the legend attached to him. But according to the story, he wept, Avalokiteshvara wept at the suffering in the world, and one tear came out of his right eye and became like, I think it was green Tara, and another tear came out of his left eye and became white Tara. Or the two, I don't know whether the eyes and the Taras match exactly, but in other words, his tears became the two main Taras. So that's what that association is. Avalokiteshvara became so popular that he made his way to China, where he became Guanyin, and he was basically merged with a Taoist, one of the great Taoist immortals, and became Guanyin, and then is probably the most popular of the bodhisattvas in Japan, in Pure Land Buddhism canon. Amitabha, who is called Amida in Japan, is also very popular. And what's interesting about him is that the legends say, it is said that he achieved Buddhahood as an incarnation in another world. In other words, on some level, he was a Buddha in another plane, in another place, another world, a different world where they had physical manifestation, but decided to pay attention to this world because of the suffering here. And so it's almost like an extraterrestrial dude, sort of, which I think is really interesting that I'm attached to him. I don't want, maybe ultra-terrestrial is probably a better term. But he is considered to be particularly efficacious in protecting a person from other people's bad karma. In other words, like the evil eye, as we would call it, or, black magic that is like thrown at you. He's particularly gifted at disentangling it and dismantling it and just making it go away, and literally just sort of creating a field that just disperses it. And he's also good at helping you deal with your own really negative karma, of which I have a ton, or I've had a ton. So he's considered to be like the Buddha of immortality. I don't care about immortality so much, but what I like about him is his ability to purify the kleshas, purify the attachments, unhook them. That to me is his good thing. Now here are two of the Taras that I deal with. I showed you Ekajati. I also work with several of the other Taras. The one I work with the most often is white Tara, which is on the left, but I do work with yellow Tara as well. And she is a Tara that is connected to the Hindu goddess Lakshmi. So she's very much connected to, you might say, material abundance, helping people if they can't pay their bills, that kind of thing. She's one of the distinctions here, as you can see here, if you look really closely at their iconography, you'll notice that white Tara is sitting in a full lotus right here. And you'll notice that yellow Tara has got her foot, her left foot, or I guess it's her right foot sort of in an active motion. She's in motion. A lot of the Taras that are in motion, like green Tara is in motion, red Tara is in motion, blue Tara is in motion, obviously Ekajati is in motion, and then yellow Tara is in motion. What that means is that they will immediately intercede. In other words, they are all about action. Whereas white Tara is more about settling down. I've heard her described as passive. She's not passive. I do not experience her as passive. In fact, I experience her as kind of fierce. She's kind of intense looking. When you actually encounter these beings in the other realm, they're kind of scary, at least to me initially, because they're very vital. They're very intense. Their energy is really intense. And if you notice, she's got this eye. Her third eye is open here. Her third eye is open. And it opens vertically instead of horizontally like ours. So the first time that I ever saw that, it kind of freaked me out. And then she also has eyes like in the palms of her hands and on the bottom of her feet. That's actually part of how you identify her. She's not always holding things, whereas, for example, yellow Tara is always holding things. So even though she technically maybe has those eyes too, you can't see them. But white Tara, you can. You know, the first time I ever encountered white Tara, she scared the crap out of me, honestly, because I didn't expect her. I thought she would just be in my imagination. I didn't expect her to be like a really vital, live being in front of me, you know, in front of my mind. I mean, I really didn't expect it. But she is very calm, and she is, at least for me, she assists me in always sort of opening up and opening up and opening up, which is partly why I don't experience her as passive at all. And then if you remember Ekajati, see if I can go back. Remember Ekajati. Come on, dude. She only has one eye in the middle of her head. She has one eye in the middle of her forehead, no eyes here. She's blind. In fact, they're depicted as sort of empty sockets covered with eyelids. She has one tooth here that is supposed to be pointed down like a purba knife, and then she has one breast, and she's very active. She's very intense. And then occasionally I also will work with Vajrapani. Vajrapani is the Dharma protector of the Nyingma school. And he has both a fierce aspect, which is on his left, which I've always thought was amusing. I have only encountered his fierce aspect maybe once or twice, and he just tickles me. He's just like a big giant, you know, with three eyes. It's like, you look like a spider, you know, except that he has just two arms and two legs. I encounter him more in his more peaceful form in the right. And I encounter him as just a very safe kind of steadying influence. Now, I did want to point something out. You notice here the halo around this dude right here. Now, this is a very Indian portrayal, by the way, of Vajrapana. He's got the little upper caste top knot here, and you notice this halo around him. The convention of that halo comes from Zoroastrianism, and it was adopted into Buddhist iconography, as well as Christian iconography. And that's just to point that out to you. And so these are individuals that I occasionally work with because I have empowerments with them. One I mentioned is Vajrayogini on the left, and then Manjusri, who is the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and he cuts through attachments, basically. Excuse me, cuts through attachments. And I haven't had to use him a lot lately. I had to use him a little bit earlier in my own Tibetan practice to kind of feel protected and feel feel like, well, to deal with attachments, but I haven't had to use him a lot lately. But he's actually over here as well. So this is White Tara behind me, if you can see this, and then Manjusri is over here. Excuse me, I have Avalokiteshvara on my bedroom door. So these I have my own little baby Tonkas. I do have a Vajrayogini Tonka in the other room. So these are the dudes that I work with. I hope that you have gotten something out of this video. I hope that this video has given you an insight into what Tibetan Buddhism is, and sort of what its history is about. Like I said, I'm not the final expert on this, and there are certainly scholars who could supplement what I say, and who might even disagree with some of the things that I've said. But these have been, what I've given you is my experience and what my knowledge base is about this. So hopefully this has all been useful for you.